Welcome to Inside AI, a podcast from the EPFL AI Center. I'm your host, Marcel Salathé, professor and co-director of the EPFL AI Center. Each episode brings you fascinating discussions with brilliant minds from EPFL and across the global AI community. From groundbreaking algorithms to ethical considerations, from technical innovations to real-world applications, we explore the technology that's transforming our world. Whether you're an AI researcher, industry professional, or simply curious about the technology that's shaping our future, join us as we venture inside AI. Today, I'm speaking with Urs Hölzle, but before we do that, I just wanted to remind you about the Applied Machine Learning Days, AMLD 2025, happening February 11th to 14th at the Swiss Tech Convention Center in Lausanne, Switzerland. The event features 3 days packed with keynotes, parallel tracks, and extensive networking opportunities, covering everything from business applications to scientific insights, startups, policy discussions, and more. A fourth day is dedicated to hands-on workshops, and with AI advancing at an unprecedented pace, don't miss the 9th edition of AMLD at EPFL. Check out 2025.appliedmldays.org for tickets and the complete program. Now, back to the conversation with Urs Hölzle. Urs is a Google Fellow and until recently was the Senior Vice President of Technical Infrastructure at Google. He joined the company as the 8th employee in 1999 when it was just a small startup. Originally from Switzerland, he received his PhD in computer science from Stanford University after studying at ETH Zurich, and he's played a key role in developing Google's technical infrastructure and data centers, focusing on scalability, efficiency, and sustainability. He led Google's cloud computing initiatives and has been instrumental in building the technical foundation that enables Google to serve billions of users worldwide. In this episode, we are talking about the critical challenge of AI's growing energy demands and also hear about his unique perspective on AI from 2 decades at the forefront of Google's technological evolution. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Urs Hölzle, and a very pleasure to have you. And you're going to speak here in your personal capacity as Urs. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So I will have properly introduced you just before this place, but obviously that includes things that are already on the public record. So I'd be quite curious to learn what is not yet on the public record because you're working on it today. So what are you up to today?
Yeah, I changed my job about a year and a half ago. So past 25 years, I sort of turned into a manager, against my will, if you want. And, I actually, it was important to do that job. And I actually, didn't mind. I liked it. But I had sort of originally really been more on the science side, not the management side. And I thought after 25 years, it would be good to go back. And also, I was in a position, fortunately, to have sort of the last piece fall in place of being able to actually hand off things to people who are super qualified. And so I wasn't really dropping anything by stepping back from management. And so since then, I've been working really as an individual engineer in sort of the general infrastructure area. Right now, I'm working on a topic that's around security. And then the other one is actually moving sort of our development internally to Google Cloud as well. Like we have an internal cloud already. It's kind of very capable. It wasn't a high priority to move. But now it's starting to be more awkward to have two. And so we're kind of starting that effort. Figuring out how to do that.
Okay. And how, maybe that's a bit a strange question, but how has the, let's say, at least recent AI craze affected your job and what you do now?
Yeah, part of it. So I'm going through projects usually in sort of a 3 to 6 month kind of cadence to help people figure stuff out. One of them was actually around AI, like compilers and language frameworks, and the performance side of it, and the development side of it. But actually, more broadly, obviously, there is a substantial investment in hardware, both on the data centers and chip side, and I'm kind of staying in touch with that because designs are evolving there. But I wouldn't say that's my main job.
All right. So you have been quite outspoken about all kinds of topics related to energy, and we recently also had a conversation about that. And of course now the energy discussion is on steroids because of AI, among other things. And so I wanted to get your opinion on that. So, I mean, I think we can undoubtedly agree that at the moment there's a massive demand for energy. I actually, when I go and sort of publicly talk about AI, I often use a slide where there are like 2 news articles from Google. I mean, I'm not picking on Google. I'm just using it because they're public, and you guys are actually very transparent about this stuff. But there's of course the famous announcement. I think it was back in 2016, maybe, when Google DeepMind announced that you had like cut your energy requirements by 40% or so. And then of course last year, right, you announced that energy requirements had gone up by I don't know, half or something like that because of AI.
Yeah.
So, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing there in that development? And we sort of on a larger scale, we can go into the details, right?
Yes. Yeah, that was actually, I think, our mistake for the numbers we put in the report, because there isn't really a story there. If we had drawn the graph of the last 15 years, you would not see AI in that graph, because we had routinely grown by something like 15 to 20, 22% a year.
I see.
And so this was like a 3 or 4 year period that this was carbon that they talked about, the absolute carbon. And so in the grander context, actually, you can't see AI. I mean, you can see a slight uptick in the last year because it was, I believe, in the high 20s, but not it's not like a day and night kind of change, but the press sort of picked that up, and we didn't, because it was sort of obvious to us. But yes, and so no question, there is a build out for AI as well. I would actually dispute the enormous things. If you look backwards, it's a few gigawatts max, right? Like if you look at NVIDIA shipments and you multiply that by 500 watts or whatever sort of the average thing, in the context of even the US electricity system, it's epsilon, right? Mm-hmm. So far, right? And then of course people extrapolate forward and do great exponential extrapolation, and then obviously you can arrive at arbitrary numbers, right?
Yeah, depending on the extrapolation. That's right. So, okay, but let's extrapolate then, because people do, right? And we want to get a sense of what could be roughly right. So I guess, I mean, there's multiple arguments. So first, maybe the current sort of comparison that I hear often made in the public is, somebody at some point pointed out that supposedly, I don't actually even think it's true, but supposedly, right, a ChatGPT request takes about 10 times as much energy as a Google search request, based on, I think, even data that's outdated from Google, let alone really getting a good handle on ChatGPT requests. But it's really making the rounds. I actually was listening to a local radio emission where it was even where the person said something of this sort that, if everybody used ChatGPT all the time, we wouldn't have enough electricity today, which is obviously incorrect. But so where do you currently see the energy needs for frontier models? What's the sort of order of magnitude we need to think about when we make these calculations? Because this is sort of an important number, right?
Yes. So I think in the long run, it's really inference that matters, right? If it doesn't, that really means that, like, why are you training, right? Because if you don't have a use case that actually sort of works at scale and is economical at scale. Today you hear people talk about 100,000 GPU clusters.
Yeah.
Right? 100,000 GPUs, like if you say 500 watts per GPU, real world, like it peaks at higher, but somewhere in the 500 watts, or maybe 750, right? So that would translate to 50 or 75 megawatts for that facility. And these are the very largest clusters today, not the toy clusters, right? People actually, when Elon said that he had one, then people didn't really believe at first that he could build one this quickly, because that's actually a ton of material in these, literally. Actually, many tons of equipment, and so it's actually mechanically and just from a construction perspective, you don't stamp these out overnight. So that's kind of the frontier-ish model would be in the 50, 100, maybe 200, right? If you extrapolate from there. I mean, I don't know what OpenAI is doing exactly. And then also we said publicly we do distributed training, so that's not necessarily a single facility in the training or a single building.
Yeah. Okay. But so
for comparison, Google's, if you look at Google's environmental report, we disclose our energy usage.
Right.
And it's in the order of 3-4 gigawatts steady state a year.
Steady state. Okay.
Right. So if we had 300 megawatts of training, then that would be 10% of our energy use.
Yeah, I see. Okay. And so then now the extrapolation obviously comes largely, so there's two factors. On the one hand, you would argue, if I assume correctly, that we will get significantly better at doing this stuff, just because the current technology stack has been essentially optimized for simply performance on benchmarks and other things, but not on energy efficiency, and so will drive energy needs down significantly. That's a correct assumption.
Yes, I mean it's the whole stack. We're like, this is a thing that's maybe 3 years old, 4 years old, right? LLMs, like let's say 2 years public and 2 years usable, non-public or so. And so it's definitely not an optimized stack, but the biggest impact is really the combination of model tuning, algorithm sort of tuning, inference, like systems implementation and the hardware. And just to mention one of them, the typical cycle is you build a huge model to get a new quality standard, and then you almost never serve that model, but you distill it, right? You optimize it into a smaller model that has virtually the same performance, but is a factor of 10 or more smaller. And then, a year later, that same model is another factor of, 5 or 10 smaller, because you just were able to distill it further. And so if you just look at inference costs from anyone, right, OpenAI and others, they've come down by something like a factor of 10 in the last 2 years. Right. So clearly those optimizations are not minor. They really are order of magnitude kind of things. And how far out that goes, I don't know, right? Because really the question is, do you have to train at large to learn something? But can you then still, like, as you get larger models, does distillation actually work better?
Yeah.
People have written papers about, most of the model actually being zero, basically, and how does that scale? Mixture of experts, right? Also is another optimization thing where you actually say, I don't have a giant model at all, and I activate only some of the experts depending on the queries. That's really TBD, but I would expect many integer factors of improvement over the short, let's say the next 2 years, just by extrapolating the current rate of improvement.
But then I guess, so on the other side of this coin are two things, right? On the one hand, models getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and of course also the use cases exploding, and models being used just pretty much everywhere. So how do you see these two things balancing each other out?
That's really hard to tell. That's kind of the question there. So for that, I think it's useful to look at just sort of the economic part, as you have done as well, and just say, well, in the end, someone has to pay for it, right? Like there has to be revenue to kind of offset the capex. Someone, I think it was Sequoia, like one of the Silicon Valley VCs wrote this position paper actually a year ago or so that they called the $600 billion gap, where they kind of looked at the rate of spend that was sort of announced or believed, and basically said, hey, we're missing, for this to be reasonably profitable, not wildly profitable, we're missing $600 billion of revenue per year across the entire industry. And when we look at it, we see maybe 50, but not 600. So that's what they call a $600 billion gap, right? And that's actually a real thing. Mm-hmm. You can bridge that for a year and say, oh, I'm in investment mode or something like that, but you can't bridge it for very long, right? That's a very large number. And so that means the efficiency and the utility and the usage have to balance out into something that, people have to pay in the end, people have to pay for. And if it's 10 times more expensive per person, but the revenue is the same, that means you can reach, by definition, 10 times fewer people, versus something that's 10 times less expensive, and you still have the same revenue in the industry. You will obviously be able to serve 10 times more people, right? In fact, probably more, because revenue will probably go up if you can serve 10 times more people. Like if it's more of an advertising-driven model, for example, versus a subscription-based model. And so these things are wildly up in the air, but I do think there are some relatively clear limits because the numbers are getting big relatively quickly. Mm-hmm. Again, the Sequoia thing was a year ago, and they called it a $600 billion gap. So that's like if it was an industry by itself. Yeah, that's something like all smartphones combined. Yeah.
But so when you say the numbers are going up quickly, you mean this gap, the numbers, yes. the investment?
As the investments that are announced go up, then obviously the revenue gap goes up. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you think there's sort of a natural limit to this, anyways, which is largely due to economics. Okay.
I'm just saying that economics in the end has to work. The numbers are too big for the economics not to work. Like nobody can finance a $600 billion gap for very long. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's just too much money. Right. And so I'm just saying either the monetization has to catch up and increase a lot from where we are, or the costs have to come down and decrease a lot from where we are, to kind of imagine this being something that reaches everyone.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of betting that the second one is easier to do than the first.
And why is that?
Well, just like, okay, here you are, you have a product. Yeah. I'm like, hey, Marcel, either 10x your revenue or drop your costs by a factor of 10. Right? Which one is more feasible? Right? The second one is an engineering job. Yeah. Right? The first one, you might have to change the world, right? Or like the way consumers think, or the structure of a market, right? It may be possible. It takes a long time, right? Yeah. Whereas making something 10 times more cheaper, actually, you have an MOE structure, you distill a little bit more, you go off like 1% of quality maybe, or whatever, right? And or you have a free model that's a lot cheaper, and then only a few people, whatever, right? Like there's many ways that are plausible where you could say, if I tell you, 10x in 2 years, or else, we go out of business, you say, that should be doable, right? Mm-hmm. But versus 10x revenue at this scale, right? $600 billion. Right?
At this scale,
unheard of, never done. Difficult stuff, right?
Yeah,
now, obviously, I'm an engineer, so maybe the second seems easier to me.
Yeah, exactly. You see a clear path there. Okay, well, I guess we could speculate forever. I guess we'll just have to wait a little bit and see how this works out. Okay, and maybe just to close on the energy question. So, are you overall like now? Let's forget just the pure focus on AI. In general, what do you see about, how do you think about energy build out for the broader development, right? Beyond AI, clouds, just digitization. I mean, obviously everybody's reading the news that the hyperscalers are buying up nuclear power plants as well, and so on. So what's going on there? Can you give us a bit of an enlightenment?
So I think, sure. The big challenge actually isn't data centers, but just electrification overall, right? Mm-hmm. Electric cars, scaling up renewable energy. Many estimates. Like I'm familiar with New Zealand, since I live there right now. Their estimate is electricity consumption is going to go up by something like 70% just through electrification of heat, transport, some chemical processes, etc. Right? And so I think in that relation, data centers isn't going to be a dominant sort of thing, because that's a very large number, right? If you buy an electric car, you probably double your electricity consumption per day just from charging. You reduce your energy consumption, right? Because electricity is more efficient, and then obviously carbon, right? But it's a big load, right? Because it charges at 7 or 11 kilowatts. And there's nothing else in your household almost that has sort of that thing. So right now, I think a lot of people kind of speculating. It's a convenient, it's a great topic. But the other thing is actually that many grids have been stagnant for the last 10 plus years. Right? If you look at US or New Zealand, probably Swiss, any energy consumption across the grid until recently, when electric cars started to take shape, it was pretty flat or even slightly down. So the grid itself is not prepared for a higher growth phase. Well, higher growth phase might mean just 3-4% a year, right? They've just not seen that for the last, in most countries, the grid has not seen that for the last 25 years. And so nobody's really set up for, what happens if I actually have a 4% increase year over year. So that is, I think, adding to the noise. And then AI sort of came out of nothing, seemingly. And so these things, I think, do get conflated a little bit.
Okay, but I mean, so nonetheless, why do we see, these companies investing in these kinds of technologies?
Yeah, so that's a long-term play. Mm-hmm. Right. So Google, for example, said, "Hey, we'll buy these 10 reactors if they actually exist." Right? None of them exist. There's not even a prototype. Mm-hmm. So that's like a 2035 thing, and pretty much some of them were even longer, probably. Like Microsoft invested in, or said it will have an offtake from a fusion reactor. Right. And literally, this thing has not been proven to work. Yeah. Right. So this is not a 2027 type kind of, we need the energy. This is just an option play in the future. Many of them are really conditional, like actually really, if you can produce it at an acceptable cost, then we will go buy it. But so those, I think, is, except for 3 Mile Island, I think, which is maybe a 5 years out or so, none of these are before 2030. So this is really just thinking into the future. At some point, it would be useful, especially as we get closer to 100% 24/7 carbon free, to actually have a baseload or tunable thing that is not solar, to sort of balance out your overall energy consumption.
Yeah. All right, makes sense.
But maybe it's not bankable. It's not bankable energy today, right? It's too far out. Yeah. Nobody's plans. Like we just talked about how uncertain it was, even in the next 3 years, right? So nobody has a plan for 2035, right? So this is not sort of an operational purchase. This is really a future, right? In 2035, this will be a great option to have.
Yeah, there's a long-term bet. No, that's clear. Good. Now, on the other side, coming back to the AI angle, are there? So, right, we mentioned this sort of example where you used AI back in the day to cut your energy needs. Do you see like, were those low-hanging fruit in a sense, and that's all taken, or do you see overall, I mean, even beyond your own industry, do you see sort of still low-hanging fruit where AI could help us being much more sustainable?
Yes, there's an insane amount of low-hanging fruit. Actually, let's stick with buildings. Buildings are controlled by some kind of control algorithm, and they're basically, by definition, they are not tuned well. Because maybe you tuned them at the beginning, maybe you tuned them for an expected usage, but the building's changing, what's inside the building's changing, and it's too expensive to maintain these control systems and tune them optimally, right? It's just too expensive, too people expensive, right? So if there's an AI that can do that for you, what we saw, and actually recently was another publication more from one of the control vendors, it was order of 30% savings during times when the building actually is, being stressed, like, you have heating or cooling load or etc. And if you look at why they are being caused, it really is a combination of two things. The most of it is the setting was just wrong. Like, you actually right now have this floor empty because you're restacking your thing, or the tenant moved out, and nobody turned down the ventilation in that place because it's actually kind of hard to do, right? Stuff like that. And then the other one is the AI tends to find things that you wouldn't have thought of, or actually answer questions empirically. Like, let's suppose you have 30% load and you have 10 fans. Should you run 10 fans at 30%, or 5 at 60%, or 3 at 100%? Right? And the answer is, it kind of depends, because the 30% might not be evenly distributed, et cetera, et cetera. And the AI tends to just kind of find, the lowest, do the hill climbing or the valley, the valley seeking in this particular case. And so it just kind of does that. And the reason it's not out yet is that every building is different, and the AI so far hasn't been general enough to kind of auto install itself, so to speak. So you can just point it at the building controls and then say, look, go at it. It takes about a year for it to learn what the building is. And until now, you had to kind of be there during that year. But I'm confident that that's solvable. And so again, if you think about, if you have 20-30% of building energy, and that's widely deployed, it's not computationally expensive. Right? Buildings are complicated if it's ultimately like 1,000 parameters that you need to control.
Yeah.
That alone would be, a multiple of the entire data center industry in savings. And that's just one example. Traffic lights, we actually worked on that for Google. There's including the substitution effect. They've shown that deploying sort of traffic light coordination reduces carbon by about 10%. In some meaningful cities. You have to go search for it to find it. It's called Project Green Light. It's another thing where it's just really hard to do by hand. Mm-hmm. Because you want to dynamically react to the traffic, to the actual traffic flows, and that's just hard to program basically for every city and for every street, etc. And so more generally, there's a long answer to your question, but the exciting thing is that whenever you move actual things, air and cars and, whatever, the intensity, the carbon intensity, the energy intensity is much, much higher than moving electrons, between the compute units of the CPU. So making that trade-off, right? Like move a few electrons in the CPU in order to move fewer atoms in the real world, is like a 10,000 to 1 trade-off type kind of thing. And so there's really a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah. So, but I mean, as you said, this is relatively simple AI. I don't want to say easy, but simple. I mean, you don't need a foundational model for this, right? So
actually you might, but yes, it's definitely not a grand challenge from a science perspective. It's a sort of a grand challenge from an engineer perspective, because this thing got to be dead simple to install, and it works in every building, and the person who installs it doesn't know anything about AI, right? That is the challenge there.
But so And so, I mean, the question I'm trying to get to is, if it's so straightforward, then why hasn't it happened yet? But you're saying the
model is straightforward.
The model, but the productization,
making it deployable, yes, productizing it so it works with the existing stuff. You don't have to rip out your control, but you basically control, feed your control measurements to it, and then have just a few set point feedback things, and making that such that an installer can do it, right? Not an engineer. That is the challenge. Right?
Yeah. But so if I would summarize the discussion in the last 30 minutes or so, if I understand you correctly, your conclusion of this is that the upsides here are actually much, much larger than the downsides. I guess for the reason that you just mentioned, we can actually use a bunch of electrons to really make a big deal, a big effect in the world of atoms, whereas just the additional use of electrons, no matter how exciting everything will get and how actively everybody uses it, won't really change things so dramatically.
I think
is that a good summary?
Yes, that's a good summary. I think if you actually have AGI, that would change things, perhaps.
All right.
Just because, and I think that's been sort of your point, and where we differed was you really need to believe in AGI for this to be true. If you had an AGI, and let's say the AGI costs 100 watts to run sort of continuously for you, is it conceivable that everyone would want one, and for everyone has a personal energy consumption that goes up by 100 watts, constant over time, right? I think if you had AGI, like something that is truly dependable and you can, it helps you do all kinds of things, that is plausible, right? Now, even then, I would argue that if you actually want to deploy, 100 watts to every person in the world, the fastest way to do it would be to make it 25 watts, right? In the part of the rollout, right? It's so you're not limited by the energy system build out, which is probably, a slower part. And you have AGI, so put it to work, optimizing your AI energy consumption. But that's really speculation because I think it's quite a bit away. Like my gut feeling is, and I'm not an expert, but my gut feeling is we're kind of in 2012, 2014 with self-driving cars, right? Made a ton of progress. Like in 2014, I was in a car. I spent half an hour driving through Mountain View, downtown traffic, broken traffic light, pedestrians, bikes. It worked just fine, right? Like it was impressive. No touch of the steering wheel, right? And 10 years later, we still don't have self-driving cars because the last part is hard, right? So I'm kind of guessing that we are there where we see some really promising first steps, but there is a lot of work to get to AGI.
Yeah.
And it might eventually happen, but it's just harder than it looks.
Sure.
Because we're overestimating the fact that, quote unquote, it works sort of most of the time. Versus if you actually have someone, you delegate certain tasks to it, it kind of has to work all the time. Yeah. And that's kind of your self-driving story. That difference has been more than a decade.
Yeah. Did that actually surprise you? I mean, so when you were sitting in that car in 2014, were you that kind of person who said that's going to take at least another 10 years, or were you also more optimistic?
No. It was super compelling. Yeah. Right? It's like, wow, right? Like this, I mean, it had a safety driver, but literally, a bike cut us off, and at some point we came to an intersection where the power had failed or the control system had failed, so it was just red blinking, and you had to do sort of first come, first serve, and it just worked, right? The biggest complaint was, why are you sticking to the speed limit when nobody else is? And people were, you're too conservative a driver, right? Right. So it definitely seemed like something that you could give to a car manufacturer. And modulo the unit costs per car, the LiDAR costs and stuff like that, it was kind of ready to go. Yeah. Right. And it was really just a cost and making the sensor smaller type of kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. So now maybe, right, this is a good segue. I mean, you mentioned before, okay, the exception to the whole energy story could be AGI, but as you indicated, there would be all kinds of, well, first of all, we could ask AGI to actually solve it, but also there would, of course, be all kinds of different problems if we had that. Now, as you say, I mean, the question when that will happen is basically anybody's guess. I think we're both probably on the more cautious side, though probably not as pessimistic as many. And I'm not going to ask you to put a number on it. I'm more curious how you think, I want to understand what you think would be the main worry, and then sort of circle back to today to the extent that those issues already should concern us today, right? So, for example, one main worry may be, well, if we have AGI, maybe just actually not have employment anymore. And that would sort of circle back to, okay, even if we are, even if it's going to take 10, 20 years, then first of all, how do we deal with it? But secondly, what does it do to the job market today? So what's...
But that's kind of, I use this just to say, energy is going to be a problem.
Yeah.
But in the end, if you write the history of AGI, the first 20 years of AGI, energy will not be mentioned. Because if whatever, right? If you replace work, right, and nobody has to work anymore, but everyone still has income. I mean, that is so much bigger story, right? If that happens,
right.
Or if whatever, World War III breaks out because the rise against the machines or something. There's just so many things that are infinitely more relevant than the energy story. That's why that's what I meant there.
Yeah.
I think the big question really is how does society work, right? And actually, how does all kinds of things work? Art, literacy, etc. In a world where humans aren't the only intelligent things, and therefore aren't the only producers of everything, right? Obviously, work, right? Art, science, maybe morals for all I care, like ethics, right? For all I care, etc. And that's really sort of a staggering thought, actually. And I don't think anyone has really sort of fully figured it, has a good story of how, let's say a good meaning a well understood story that has sort of the decision tree or the scenario tree of all the things that could happen there.
Yeah.
But it would certainly be a gigantic change. Obviously more so than the steam engine and the internet and, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
There's a lot of potential for good because you could, would energy efficiency go up, right? Of course, right? Could we solve the climate problem? Super likely.
Yeah.
Because you just at scale, with all the sub problems, right? And so on and so on. On the other hand, the thought of not actually being the center of society as a human is pretty unsettling to most.
Yeah.
And also most institutions, et cetera, are really set up to assume 100% humans.
Yeah.
Our laws, right? Basically assume 100% humans. So if that's not true, then what does it mean?
Exactly.
Right. If I damage a robot, right, or like an AI, if I turn off an AI, is that killing?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. There's so many questions. We don't even know which ones to ask, right? I mean, one of the things I would find extremely strange is what would it actually think, right? Given it's in face of it's like living at the same time as its creator, which is something that no species ever had to deal with. So that's kind of weird.
Well, and also if you don't have lots of philosophers have argued that sort of our experience of the real world sort of deeply shapes how we think. Like we actually live in a physical reality. We experience things like temperature and pain and everything, and we interact in physical ways with everything. Clearly, well, not clearly, but the AI probably wouldn't, unless every AI has a body as well, which seems odd, right? that actually leads to a very different culture, if you want, or a different way of thinking, probably. And therefore, like, how does that even, like, how do we even communicate sort of the finer things? If we come from a very different, it's like a culture gap or culture clash, if you want, that is really giant compared to, a Swiss and an American talking is a much smaller gap. And we already may find that bewildering at times. Right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's roll the tape back a few years, or maybe forward a few years from now, though not from AGI. So one of the things that's puzzling to me, and I remember we spoke just shortly after ChatGPT came out and had a few thoughts, right? What's going to happen next? Like, one of the things that surprised me in a way is how fast the technology has developed in those 2 years, how much was possible, and how little has actually changed in sort of the world and how business operates. Now, people say, well, that's just because there's just a delay, right? Everything that's human operated, which businesses still fundamentally are, most of them, just takes a lot of time. And so now we just have this massive delta of what is in principle possible with this technology and what is actually being executed, right? What is actually being realized. And you'll see just massive shifts in the next years. Would you agree with that? Or how do you think about our current way of sort of integrating this stuff into our economy?
I think it's a mix between two things. One is that, like, as Ethan Malik says, if you ask companies, are you using AI? Something like 10% say yes. If you ask company employees whether they use AI, something like 60% or whatever say yes. So actually, a lot of the usages happen without the knowledge of the company, sort of at the employee level. So the actual impact may be bigger than it looks like outside of the programming kind of thing, right? Where usually it's it's in the open, right? And so that's kind of number one. Number two, I absolutely agree that if progress stopped today, right, like we hit a wall, no LLM is better than whatever is available today, you'd still see substantial impact in the next 5 or even 10 years. And that's because translating this into an application that actually works in business is huge. And that's, I think, I feel what's misunderstood, and what actually in part is a $600 billion problem in the industry. Today, none of the chat bots or anything except for the specialized AIs like AlphaFold is actually very reliable. And so to make them into a business tool, you actually have to do work that is domain specific. You probably have to narrow what the thing does and trade sort of generality for accuracy. And that's where the value is created, right? If I do AI for dentists and I actually make it work and it actually helps a dentist, in their practice, for them to save big bucks, they actually rely on a quality standard, and someone needs to stand for that quality standard. And that's the company that makes dentistry software. And that company will get 90% of the revenue that is AI enabled, and 10% is the infrastructure, like the actual model serving or whatever else they're doing, right? And that will play out 1,000 times across different industries, and that just takes time, right? That's why you don't see the impact, because those things, if you had AGI, you could just go send it to the dentist and it will be useful, right? But you don't have AGI, and so when you send it to the dentist, it's kind of promising, but it makes mistakes all the time, and they will be expensive mistakes. So the dentist is like, no, I can't do that, right? Like, that's not, that's not good enough, right? And so that translation is what would actually create what is still happening and why the rollout is slower. The technology generically is just not good enough to rely on it on a business sense, outside of a few places where you actually have a human anyway who then takes the raw thing and actually turns it into something better, where it's kind of like translation used to be, where it was a good first pass and then a real translator would actually fix it and make a real translation, right? Those use cases kind of work today, but a dentist probably doesn't want to work that way. They want to have the AI, look at your teeth and then figure out, what's the best way to get them to be beautiful again, right? Or, whatever, or medical, or all of these things, right? The standards, the quality standards will be high, and you have to do domain-specific work to get it there.
Yeah. Is there also the possibility that there just hasn't been the time for people to truly wrap their head around what these things are actually capable?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like with the internet, I mean, you guys famously, didn't just start at the start of the internet. It took you weren't even the first search engine. And then things like Facebook and so on came much, much later, right? Because it just needed people to even first get acquainted with this stuff.
One actually have the idea, like find the use case, etc. To me, it's actually kind of similar. If you look at the internet, 10% of the value is with Google, for example, right? And 90% of the value is for the economy overall, right? Pretty much every dollar of ad spend generates $10 of revenue. And this is just a marketing expense, right? Which is a small fraction of the overall kind of thing. And it took 15 years for YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, sort of, that was kind of WhatsApp, right? Those kind of things to actually be popular, right? It's an enormous amount of time.
Yeah.
Some of it is because, like say in the case of YouTube, it wasn't feasible 10 years earlier. It was just bandwidth was too expensive, right? You can't do video in 2000, right? And you could do video in 2010, right? But most other things actually would have been just fine, like WhatsApp would have been just fine. It just, like, nobody had invented it yet.
Yeah.
And also, to some extent, there's a bootstrapping. There aren't enough participants in the network, and then actually something like WhatsApp doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so we still have that kind of thing with LLMs today, right? It probably has 10% market penetration in terms of people actually understanding how to use it.
Yeah.
They may have played with it, but they, like a lot of people, try to use it sort of like a search engine.
Yeah.
And it's actually not great at that, right? It's not that's not really its best use case.
Its best use case,
Its factuality isn't great, right?
Exactly. So, but we use it for that, right? Because we're used to that, and so it just takes some time for people for those other use cases to become much more common.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. And so bringing this a little bit into geopolitics. So I guess we'll see just an explosion then of new services and products in this space. And, it doesn't probably take, you probably don't need to be a good fortune teller to assume that a lot of that will happen in the US, as opposed to, for example, in Europe, where I'm sitting and where you're from. And that's going to be an issue, certainly not for the US, but for Europe. I mean, we now have all these discussions here, right, about digital sovereignty. That's sort of the new big policy topic, which can be translated into, we have absolutely no powerful technology companies at home, right? It's sort of the term for that. So how do you look at this? You say, look, it's already game over. The train has already left the station on AI as well, or is there still ways for other parts of the world that are not the US to catch up with this?
I think there is, but I think Europe has a mindset problem, not a talent problem. Like, as I said, I believe in AI that 90% of the value is going to be in the applications, right? You don't need to own the foundation model. You just use one, right? And it's clear that there's competitive offerings, so you're not going to be stuck with a single vendor, right? Likely. But you were on Arena last week, right? I sort of watched most of it, and that's what distinguishes Europe from the US. Like, it was basically 99% about the problems and the risks and 0 about the opportunities, right? Exactly. If you go in with that mindset, you're guaranteed not to realize the opportunities, right? I don't want to belittle the problems. The problems are real, but you got to be something like 80% let's realize opportunities, 20% let's make sure these are the good opportunities, not the bad opportunities. And then you make progress, right? And so I feel that the EU is really stuck in this defensive mindset where, one, they're afraid of the Americans, and two, they just can't see the upside. And as a result, you just have no, like, anyone who actually wants to do this thing, right, will rightfully say, this is not the market where I should do it.
Yeah.
Let me move somewhere where actually I can roll stuff out and realize the opportunity, right? So that, I think, is if Europe, someone in Europe, I say this as a technologist, a few years ago, 2 years ago, whatever, someone proudly said, oh, we're going to be the worldwide leaders in regulation, right? Like, that's Europe's thing, right? I mean, oh my God, right? Like, you cannot possibly have a future if that is your, what you're going to be good at.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying regulation is bad, right? I'm not saying thinking about problems is bad. Of course, it's essential. But if you do it to the exclusion of everything else, you're not going to do anything productive, right? That is where. So I think most of it is mentally, the mindset stuck versus it's too late for everything, right? Because if you believe in applications being 90% of the revenue, there's thousands of them, right? Tens of thousands of them. Right? And Europe actually historically has been very good at these kind of things. Niche things, relatively niche things, but you do a really good job, and therefore that industry really buys from you because they care about value more than cost, right? Yeah. Because in their business, that actually is the right trade-off.
Yeah. So I would agree with you, but it also makes me a little bit depressed because, right, as opposed to, it just being some regulation thing, which you could change quickly, right? As you know, right, culture doesn't just change overnight.
No, it's true, but it's becoming so apparent. I mean, Germany's struggling right now, so I'm kind of hoping that there will be a mental breakthrough, so to speak, where people really realize that we are, shooting ourselves in the foot.
It's too painful.
And we actually will do better in doing 80% doing and 20% worrying, because among other things, you do a better job about worrying if you actually are doing stuff, right? And you are competent, like you understand what you're doing and where things are going, and et cetera, right? So doing regulation in an area where you actually have very little industry doing the thing is sort of just unlikely from an engineering perspective, right? It's kind of unlikely that you get it right. It's a complicated problem if you haven't lived the problem yourself on the creation side, right? If you want to do this thing. So maybe that will cause a change, because by now it's really obvious that across industries, just mentioning cars and, it has become an innovation thing and a software thing. And if you're not good at innovation and software, then even for cars, that's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. No, fully agree. I guess the question is still like, who has to do what? I mean, I guess there maybe is now sort of a sort of understanding that, okay, we should be careful with this regulation thing. On the one hand, we should probably invest more in technology, but still, sort of the whole sort of let's be pioneers, let's be risk takers. I'm still a bit worried that that's just not something that changes overnight. And I'm trying to understand, right, what we can do. I think it's fundamentally modifiable. I mean, it's definitely not something that's set in stone. And as you say, right, it's not even necessarily, even if you sort of go on a historic trip and you say, well, the US, right, is mostly the people who were pioneers who left. And so now all that's left in Europe, right, is people who just always said, no, let's not.
That's probably not true, right? Yes. It happens in other places, right? Like exactly. Pharma or, whatever, right? And then there's the occasional Spotify's. I mean, I think I would even say in Switzerland, I'm kind of a little bit more optimistic than, let's say, in the rest of the EU, because one, it's not the same. And Switzerland now actually has a startup scene that's, at least decent. Yeah. Right? Like they're doing all kinds of things, and there's no reason to believe that they can't do AI applications, right? And that they won't do AI applications. It's just Switzerland is too small to change Europe.
Sure.
And even in Switzerland, there is this mindset, not in the startups, but sort of in the rest of the world. Let's first talk about all the risks in abstract, right? Before we do something, or before we actually So my argument there would be actually what you really need to focus on is get an industry that it is actually come to scale. Let's say you have an industry that across Europe produces $100 billion of sort of AI related applications. At that point, you have so many people to talk to.
Yeah.
That actually, how do you update your policy, or how do you regulate this thing, et cetera, is going to be a much more informed opinion, or much more informed process. And then you actually have a chance to go from $100 billion to $1 trillion. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But yes, I'm kind of pessimistic about right now that happening. Right now, these things are happening despite sort of policy, that's actually very sad, because like we see it with Google Zurich, the engineers are just as good, right? Yeah. And they're just as innovative, right? We actually do part of Gemini in Zurich, or AI things, right? And Google Maps, and whatever, right? So it's not at all a talent thing.
No, not at all. I fully agree. That's the frustrating part, right? It's like everything is here, and then sometimes people tell me, but it's so safe in Europe. It's like that should be actually. Then you should expect more risk taking, right? Because it's safe. Because you can literally not end on the street, right?
Yep. Well, and also I think that actually reminds me of another thing. So one is really this focus on the risks that is a blocker, but then the second one is that there is this implicit assumption that doing nothing is safe.
Yeah.
And it's just completely not true, right? I mean, you can see it with cars, right? Yeah. 10 years of doing nothing, and suddenly China is the biggest car exporter in the world. And the only thing you can do to compete is put up tariffs, right? And yes, there's subsidies and stuff like that. But if you look at the Chinese cars and the software stack, right, it actually beats pretty much every European software stack, right? That was an innovation thing, not a subsidy thing.
Yeah.
And that just shows you that the status quo is not safe.
Yeah.
Right? Like doing nothing has a very high cost potentially is actually super risky. Right? Whereas if you look at the discussion, it's always, doing something, here's all these risks, right? But if you don't do anything, we don't have to talk about risks because, we're safe, right? Nothing will happen, right? And that sort of asymmetric thinking, I think is another reason why people aren't sort of moving. In the false belief that that's okay.
Exactly. Yeah, that's sort of reminiscent of this Lincoln quote that I read again the other day. But you think education is expensive? Try ignorance, right? That's really expensive. Yes. So
I'm not even saying yes. Yeah.
No, that's so. If you were 25, would you just drop everything? And I assume you would still. Let's see. I guess when you were 25, you were at ETH. Is that correct?
I went to the US at 25, yes.
Okay, so what would you just drop everything and do an AI startup? What would Urs Hölzle do today if he were 25?
I don't know. I mean, I was going to the US to do my PhD, right? I had some stuff before college and whatever, right? I mean, I would probably still go to the US unless I had found, because I went to the US because there was a particular professor, at Stanford who did work that I was really interested in, right? And so if you want to do something that you're really interested in, you want to go find that place, right? And today in Europe, if you say, okay, where is the really interesting stuff happening? That would be sort of the alternative, right? In a certain way, we're actually a little bit better off than we were in 88. For example, in 88, the EPFL was not a thing in computer science, or was much, much smaller. And actually, the thing I was interested in computer science, that just did not happen in Switzerland. In fact, it kind of didn't happen in Europe. And so, you sort of have to go to the US. Here, I think in that sense, we're better off. Like if you want to do AI, there's actually options in Switzerland. If you want to do a startup, yes, I think it's just easier in Silicon Valley than anywhere in Europe, AI or not, right? So in that sense, I'm not sure I would do AI.
Really?
Systems person. I mean, something around AI, right? But maybe at the higher level. I was always interested in sort of the performance and systems kind of things. So assuming it's the same me, I would kind of say, how do I make AI more efficient, or something like that. Right?
I see. Is that? I mean, assuming there's also a lot of people listening that are actually kind of in that situation, right? That are currently maybe still studying. Or thinking or doing a PhD or what have you. I've always found that as sort of somewhat challenging, right? To think about, should you just follow your sort of intellectual curiosity, or should you just more follow the business opportunities at that age, right?
I mean, for me, I would say the answer is the privileged situation you're in if you're in computer science is that the two are compatible in sort of most scenarios, so you don't have to obsess over the economic part, right? And so in that sense, you can, like, if you want to do computer science for medicine or for banking, right, for finance or for computer science itself, or for something else, right? You basically have that choice, right? And so I would actually kind of optimize for what are you really interested in. Maybe do a sanity check that it's actually not, doomed sort of economically, but that will very, very likely pass because you're just going to do better work if you're really passionate about it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I would say is it is useful to change your environment. For example, in the beginning, when I went to the US, I was actually bothered about the optimism of people coming from Switzerland. Because my first reaction, because my first reaction was kind of like, hey, actually, you're really sort of blindly optimistic. You're not thinking about the risk, right?
Yeah.
But then you sort of realize that actually, in a way, it is an enabler, right? For most things, when you do a startup, if you knew how hard it was, you would think twice about actually doing it, right? Yeah. So you kind of need a certain amount of optimism as a defensive, as a psychological defense to make you believe you can actually do it. And that actually kind of, is useful.
Yeah, no, that's true. My this is totally off topic, but my pet sort of armchair theory why kids make you not sleep, babies, is so that you forget, so that you have more kids again. But hard to test, right? When it's actually
induced amnesia, yes. Induced amnesia, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So I don't want to take too much of your time. I maybe just have one more question that you surely have been asked 1,000 times already, but I'm still curious because I haven't heard it anywhere. But so you're obviously famously one of the very early hires at Google. And do you think about it? Do you sort of think about it? So yeah, that was kind of, everything was kind of obvious from the get-go, or are you just constantly like scratching your head and say, how the hell did that happen? I mean, how obvious was that things would just go that way back in the?
Not at all.
Not at all.
No. I think there's really two things. One is, I think the ability to predict, 3 years out is actually pretty bad. Like, people overestimate how much they know about the future 3 years from now. Because, for example, in 2021, they wouldn't have talked about chatbots. Right? Yeah. Even though there was a Lambda, for example, inside of Google, and remember, we had to fire an engineer who thought it was self-aware and needed to be protected, etc. That was before ChatGPT. It was just not on the thing. And so the history of Google has been full of these things, right? Where you just don't see that coming. And I think, like smartphones, right? Everyone knew that in theory was possible, but like how deeply it would actually change things wasn't clear when the iPhone was announced. Most people weren't like, oh, wow, I forgot, like, this is the thing, right? It was just like, oh, how would this ever work, right? And it doesn't have a keyboard, and it's just,
famously.
So first Android phone had a keyboard, actually, because the ISP that launched it really, really wanted one, right? Anyway, so it was certainly full of surprises. At the beginning, it wasn't clear what the business model was. Right? So when I started, it was really, I had a 1-year sabbatical, and while my wife was finishing in Stanford, and I was like, I'm sure it's going to be interesting technically, like I'll learn something. And then after a year, we can figure out, do we want to go back to Europe, or do we want to go somewhere else, or should I go apply for a different faculty position, etc. And it wasn't, and then 25 years later, I will, right? That wasn't a plan. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, hard to predict. But at any point it was obviously clear that it was still, if you say sort of 3 years is sort of the horizon of where we have at least a chance of having some predictability. At any point it just obviously looked extremely good. But it was, I mean, what I'm asking also is, it's nonetheless not sort of self-evident that a search engine company, right, would eventually become, such a major, if not the major tech player in the world, right, over such a long period of time, right? So you must have had these moments all the time, right?
Yes. Again, that's the odd thing in a way where, and it's certainly, I think you got to give Lang Sergey a lot of credit. Is that, yes, it's actually highly non-obvious. In retrospect, it sort of seems like a well-planned path, but it was really sort of hill climbing, and then surprising things happened, and you can take advantage of it. And, Android, Gmail, Chrome, Maps, like all of these things, were not on the map at all in 1999, and actually would have been lunacy to even attempt, because the time wasn't ready. And so I think the first time it was really clear that Google was going to work as a commercial thing was probably like 2002 or so, because we took a while to find an ad model that actually worked. It wasn't always auctions. And until then, we were, living off of the initial investment and trying to make ends work.
Yeah.
In all kinds possible. Right?
Yeah.
And I always say we were, if Google had been founded even 9 months earlier or 9 months later, it probably, it might not have worked.
Yeah.
Because 9 months later, you wouldn't have gotten funding, and the bubble burst. Right? We got funding in June 1999, and so March 2020 was already the crash.
2000,
I watched 2000, and then 9 months earlier, we might have made the same mistake. It was still at the height of the bubble, right? And we might have made the same mistakes than others in just kind of spending too much money and then running into a wall in 2000.
Yeah.
So a lot of luck, right? A lot
serendipity, as always. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Urs. That was super interesting. And thanks for everything. And I'm sure we'll catch up in the future and see how some of these projections played out and what's next. Good. That's right. Thanks so much.
We are at least partially right. Yes.
Exactly.
Thanks so much. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao, Urs.
Yeah.